Hello, everyone. This is Tech Friday, and I'm Daniel Tayyab, your host. And today I have with me Mohammad Ahsan Ayaz, who is an expert in Google certifications, and he he's basically a blogger, an open source contributor, and he has a big experience, 8 years of experience in web development, web technologies, hybrid mobile apps, professional and progressive experience of more than 8 years. He's also a Google certified expert, and he is an expert on Angular as he has written a book on it, uh, the Angular Cookbook. So, Essen, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. Hope you're doing
Uh,
well as well.
yes, I'm doing well as well. So, can you show me the book which you have written, the Angular Cookbook?
Yeah, definitely. I can probably show you. So this is the book that I wrote, and we published this last year in August. And yeah, it has more than 600 pages. It has more than 80 recipes, as it says here, and it's in the format of it's in the form of recipes. So essentially you have a problem, then you follow this recipe, and then boom, you have the solution. And then you can see how the recipe changed it. And essentially there are multiple small recipes that could take like 5 minutes for you to follow. And you know then exactly, okay, what would happen if I get this problem while I'm working with Angular, and then you can quickly go to the recipe and see an example to work with. As I mentioned, this was released last year, and it's amazing that we've got over 23 reviews on Amazon that shows a 4.4 rating out of 5, which is super cool. And we have been able to sell just the print copies, more than 500 copies so far, and it's still growing very good, alhamdulillah.
All right, that's very good to hear. And I've heard from you that you are releasing a version 2 of it.
Yes, we are in the talks of the version 2 because this book performed very well. So the publishers are very happy about this. There's a particular sort of committee in the pack publishing that's called the expert committee, which only look for very good potential books or articles. So they are in contact with me. So we are looking at what has changed from the past, and if there are any topics, any new topics that we would like to involve, or just show some different examples for the existing recipes, because this book is still valid for the latest version of Angular, so nothing has changed much, but there are some new topics that we may introduce in the second edition.
Right. So, as you know, in Angular, every year I think two new versions are introduced, and there are a small bit of changes in every version. So, for this cookbook, the recipes which are written in this cookbook, do they cover all of that, the updates?
Yes. So the past two versions, version 13 and version 14, what they have incorporated is essentially the underlying engine, which is the IV engine. So a lot of work has been done, sorry, on that. And then also there has been a lot of work on the standalone components and making it reusable and more performant. But as a core of Angular, the core API of Angular is exactly the same. I still am thinking about kind of migrating all the projects that we have for this recipe, because it's uploaded on GitHub from Angular 12 to Angular v14. We are going to see what changed and what not. But even for this book, everybody would have even Angular version 14, and we are going to continue to upgrade this inshallah as well. So yeah, we'll know what has changed, but so far I'm not aware of any breaking changes following the release notes and the change logs. So there's no breaking change as this book has.
Right. Um, the topic of our conversation for today was basically why Angular when already have React. So, as you know, as most of the front end developers would know, Angular and React are both frameworks for front end development. So, first of all, I would like to ask you, what is the difference between these two?
So the major difference between React and Angular is React is essentially a library. It's a very small, very fast library that you can just get started with pretty easily. and Angular is a full blown framework. I mean, if you go into the differences, there are huge differences among those. But to start with, we can definitely say that when you're working with React, you don't get all of the things out of the box. You have to decide where to go from. For example, for
Right.
router, there are multiple routing packages that you want to use. For HTTP calls, you have different packages to use that. When you work with Angular, all of those things come together as a bundle. So all you need to do is just get started with it without having to waste time into installing dependencies, maintaining them, and whatnot. So Angular does it for you.
Right, right. So let's say there are a lot of prospect engineers, prospect software developers, new software developers coming in our company. Um, do if they want to start front end development, or if they are not doing internships, not doing professional work, if someone just wants to start front end development, React would be, you can say, a better choice for them.
Now this is a really interesting question because better is subjective. What do you consider better? What factors are you comparing when it comes to selecting either of those frameworks? So both of these have pros and cons. If you want to
Right.
get started very quickly, then you can go with React. But if you want to go further and you have to have a consistent sort of developer experience plus the knowledge base, then Angular is much preferred. So Angular, uh, it is assumed that Angular is more difficult somehow, and that is because it is a framework. It is not a library. I mean, you cannot compare apples with oranges, right? So
Of
React is
course.
a really simple library. You get started with it, boom. But now then you have to learn all the package and all that bells and whistles. Then it becomes more complicated. With Angular, it first or the first time you are trying to do it, it would take more time. But then after it, if you jump on a new project, you're going to be super fast because you would know the entire ecosystem. So if I summarize it for you for the question that you have asked, it is easier to get started with React, but it's harder to maintain a really good standard when you're working with React. So unless you have, if you're junior or if you're someone who's trying to find internship, then yes, React would be easier for you to learn. But you will be baffled when you go into a team and see that the engineers there are writing React completely different than what you know. So there can be
Hmm.
multiple type of approaches, design patterns that people use, and that is because React is very unopinionated. Everyone has their own opinion about it, whereas Angular, since it's a framework, it enforces you to write the code in a certain way. Their standards, their practices, their approaches, the community hates some of the things that developers do, and therefore no one does it. So what ends up is everybody who has worked with Angular, when they switch to a new project with Angular, or if someone comes new in your team, in your Angular project, then most likely they would be very comfortable in getting up to speed compared to React projects. And that is what I have experienced in past 9 years of my web development experience.
Right, right. But you mentioned unopinionated. Angular
Mhm.
is more unopinionated than React. I was
It's the other way
actually,
around. It's the other way
it,
around.
it's the other
React
way
is
around.
very unopinionated. Angular is very opinionated.
All right. Basically, when I was researching on this subject, I came across this line that you told, the unopinionated one, and I
Mhm.
couldn't understand it.
Mhm.
What does it mean to be unopinionated?
It means what approach do you use for structuring your code, or essentially the design patterns that you use, or different techniques that you use for your web applications. For example, where do I put my code that has to call an API? Let's just think about this example. Or where do I put the code for when the API data comes back? If I have to process it, transform it before it goes to the rendering state, where do I put that code? So just for this example, if you look at React projects, you'll find enormous amount of approaches that people take. Some people do it in, for example, Redux files. Some people create their own services for this. Some people just do it directly in the components. So everybody do their own things. Some people use hooks for this. When it comes to Angular, we have a strict rule of every API call that is to be done, and every data processing, which is processing heavy function, it has to be in an Angular service. Now, if you're using Redux, even with Angular, then the Redux part of the code should not be doing the HTTP calls. And if someone is doing that, that means that they're not a very experienced Angular developer, or they have not seen the standards or the community guidelines, or have had a chat with the people. So essentially, in the projects that I've worked with, which are huge enterprise projects with millions and millions of monthly active users, even for those, when we look at the code itself, even if we are using Redux, the Redux part of the code in Angular is usually used for the Reduxy things, producing actions, handling effects. But when it comes to the same point that I mentioned, making an HTTP call and transforming the data, that always happens in an Angular service. And similarly, there are multiple things that we could talk about in which Angular is very opinionated on, hey, this is the opinion of the community, that this is how you would do it. And with React, it's a lot different then.
Right. So it makes React more flexible.
It makes React more flexible for those who want to have the freedom of deciding how you want to do it. Flexibility is good and bad at the same time. It's good because you have the freedom to do any way you want, but then you have to maintain it. If a new person comes into a React project, the person has to spend some time understanding the paradigm that you folks have done. And if there is no senior engineer in the team, for example, then that would mean that three different engineers have different styles of code. They have different
Right.
standards being followed, and now there comes a fourth engineer, and he is writing or she is writing a completely different style of code, which is maybe tested, maybe not tested. It may use the same functionality, it may do a lot of code duplication, so there's no really standard around it. But again, it depends on if you have a senior engineer in the team or not. In all of my years of experience, the only place where I have really seen a React project handled really well is Klarna. So when I moved to Sweden, I worked in Klarna for about 2 years. And the only reason that worked is because Klarna had more than 200, no, 2000, no, 200, or no, let me think. It's 2,500 engineers that I can remember.
Right.
And out of those, at least 50 are architects or senior engineers. And those are the people who, or there's a team that actually enforces all of the rules. For example, all the teams worked on their features, while there's a different team which has implemented all the linting rules or the JavaScript lint rules, that you should do this and not that. So even if someone tries to do something crazy in React, they get an error because that is not part of the style guides. And similarly,
Right.
they have a lot of documentation. So this is something that what I'm talking about, that if you have a React project, you would have to have someone senior in the team defining how to structure the code or what practices to use, or just use something from Airbnb style guides or JS standard guidelines. You have to use it. Whereas with Angular, a lot of that comes out of the box, and the community usually knows about it because it's opinionated. Everybody talks about it.
Right. Right. Right.
Mhm.
Um, what are the differences between the communication of components in Angular and in React?
That's a really good question. So when it comes to Angular, the component communication out of the box has multiple approaches, out of which the most famous is observables. So in Angular, it's very easy to just create an observable, and every component can just subscribe to it with all the changes that can be there. When it comes to further modes of communication, we have a way of communicating via inputs and outputs, which is a two-way communication. Whereas when we talk about React, the data flow is usually one way that comes from top to bottom in this particular situation. It's sort of like Angular, but not entirely like Angular itself. So I would say that when it comes to React, we have the context API for doing all the magic. Then we have the hooks to maintain those data as well. But when it comes to Angular, then we have inputs and outputs. We have behavior subjects or observables to do the same things out of the box. And then we have Angular services as well, which sometimes act as the data stream for all those components. So the it has some sort of options defined, I would say, in Angular. Like, these are the three approaches that you could take. With React, I think you can, since it's flexible, you can also invent your own sort of way of communication. But out of the box, I think it's just the one way communication from top to bottom.
Right. So basically, it all comes down to flexibility of Angular, because Angular has been worked on many versions, and Angular has been there for a longer time. So does that affect the differences of component communication?
I think it's really about the core of the library or the framework itself, because I mean, in Angular, Angular has been there for more than 10 years now, as far as I remember.
Yeah,
Because my first day at job was to understand what Angular is and to teach my seniors while I was an internee. So I've been working it from the first day of my job.
right,
So Angular JS had a different mode of communication. Angular has a different one, and then React has different one. And then also, if you can compare it with further components like, or further libraries like Svelte, we have Solid.js. It's basically the core of how they have imagined everything going on. So I think it doesn't matter how long a framework is there for, because I recently worked with Solid.js, and I have a video that I'm preparing for that. It's very promising, it's very interesting, it's very reacty or reactive. So it's going to be out more likely next month or something. uh,
right.
but yes, I think it doesn't matter how long a framework has been out there, but the community support definitely matters.
Right. I've actually seen your YouTube channel, and I've watched some of your videos. So it's a very informative channel, and
Thank you.
I hope you get more subscribers and you get more audience. Um, it, I usually watch the channels which are related to tech, because I also have an interest in software development. I also have done some software development, starting from HTML, CSS, and then worked my way onto Angular in about 2 3 months. At that time, I remember I was working on Angular 6. I think it was 2019,
Mhm.
and since then, Angular has changed many of the things, and it is now on, I think, 13th, 14th version now.
Yeah, V14 was launched like a month or two ago.
Right. All right. So, moving on to my next question. What are the state management practices, difference of state management practices between React and Angular?
Yes, so there are different things that React follows. So we can first talk about that. That React is has its own state within the components themselves. Then there are third-party APIs as well, but let's talk about the core ones. So we have the context API for state management. Then we have hooks for state management. Um, and then we also have the component state itself that we use if you're using a class component, for example, using the set state method. But then there are third party libraries like Redux is a really good library. We have MobX, which is also a really interesting library. Not a lot of people use that, but it's still very interesting. And then we have Zustand. So I think recently my favorite has been Zustand because it doesn't have a lot of boilerplate per se that Redux uses. And also there's a lot of debate in the community or in the React community about Redux being even a good pattern or not. But I personally like Zustand because you can just give this a class and that behaves as a reactive state management library, which is super fun to use. When it
Right.
comes to Angular, then we have a lot of things that happen. For example, the first way is to have a component itself, the state that it has. Then also there are a lot of things that help out with it. For example, if you want your component to see or to reflect the change, Angular has this API called the change detector, and it's very flexible. I mean, if you have, for example, a really crazy DOM tree, and what you want to do is at some point you want to cut this node out of the tree, and you
Right.
want that every child should not be reflected when there's a change at the top, you could actually do that for some amount of time. And a really interesting use case would be when you know that this is not going to change, this is a presentational component. For example, you have a blog post component, you know that nothing is going to change this blog post
Right.
itself, but then you have, for example, another sibling of the blog post that is essentially comments. Now comments would change, but the blog post will never change. So by default, Angular or any framework would just assume that everything changes when you click a button, when you do some crazy stuff. Then it would
Mm.
expect that, hey, some variable changed, let's go and check which one changed, and then now we'll re-render it. But
Right.
with this approach, you can actually cut the change detector ref completely, and that gives you very good flexibility on performance. So Angular will not detect any change on that. Also, there are a lot of approaches like the on push strategy, which increases a lot of performance. I have a complete recipe in my book about the on push strategy as well. But
Right.
then the state management gets much more reactive and interesting when it comes to observables, because Angular was the first one to basically use observables heavily with all the operators and RxJS shenanigans. But essentially, with observables, even without any external library, it becomes much interesting that how quickly a particular component can, or a lot of components can subscribe to a single data store without having to have that hierarchy. Otherwise, what would happen is that you have a grandparent component that passes the data to its the parent, and then that goes to the child, that goes to the grandchild, and then if you want to communicate back to the top, then you go step by step up, emitting output events. Similarly, how React would do it, you would pass functions and then you would call those function chain. In Angular, that happens the same. But when you introduce observables or a central database like Redux, then it becomes very interesting. So by default, Angular has this this state management with observables, but then you have also a port of Redux that is called NGRX. I also have a
Right.
complete chapter of NGRX in the book as well. But then you have further interesting options like MobX is also on Angular. I don't think Zustand is on Angular, but we have NGXS, which is sort of a trimmed version of NGRX, which is the Redux port. But NGXS kind of slims it down a bit. So yeah, there are a lot of options available there, but I think when it comes to again the opinionated way of working with Angular, I think most of the community just says go with NGRX because it's a very enterprisey tool to use, and you can predict all of the cool things around it. So yeah,
Right.
that would be a really interesting explanation of the question.
Right. Um, I just remembered a question when I was researching about Angular versus React.
Mhm.
Um, when I asked our software developers in our team, um, what is the difference between Angular and React? So they said that Angular is a full-time framework, but the React is like a library, and they compared them to you can say is like Angular is like biryani, the full the full package with chicken and stuff in it, and React is like boiled rice, which goes with anything.
Yeah.
How true of a statement would you say that is?
I think it's pretty accurate because, as I mentioned, if you want to build an enterprise application, it is possible with what comes out of the box with Angular. When it comes to React, then you have to do a lot of things to make sure that that happens. Um, and I think when it comes to the as you mentioned that it's just like boiled rice, and that is pretty much accurate. I think when you're starting to work with React, or I think especially the people who are interns or who are juniors or who just start React, I think we can get feedback from them as well, but most of them would say that when we are starting to learn React, I believe within like a day, maybe a day is a lot more, maybe a couple of hours, they would have to install a third party package for sure. They would have to
Right.
install something for routing, they would have to install something for state management, they would have to install something for testing, for example. So it really depends on what they're going with. Whereas Angular, I could start working on an application and it would be long before I would need a third party library. Before I go to that, I can implement a lot of things from what comes out of the box.
Right. I really like this comparison with the boiled rice and biryani because, as your book mentions, it is Angular recipe.
Recipes, yes. Yes.
All right. So we have another question from our LinkedIn viewers. The question is basically from one of our software developers, which says, which stack works better with Django Python specifically, Angular or React? I mostly have seen React plus Django as demand in US market for full stack development. What are your personal views?
So the thing is, whenever, and this is a really interesting and a very often asked question about the demand of Angular versus React. So I think it's going to be general regardless of Django and Python. So when it comes to React, you could say that if there are 2 million jobs of React, then there are going to be 1 million jobs of React. Oh, sorry, Angular. So React has more jobs doesn't mean that Angular doesn't have jobs.
Right.
There have been 9 years since Angular was out, and I still get a lot of requests of long-term support for Angular JS, Angular 2, Angular 4, Angular 5. And then also there are even new projects that are working with Angular. Even at Synchron, where I work today, we have a lot of products starting to work with Angular. We support huge enterprises. We support Scania, which is the biggest company to build trucks in the entire Europe. We have Volvo. We have other giants like Ford is also,
Right.
Nissan is also our customer. So they handle their inventory, their pricing. We basically provide them heuristical analysis of their stock, and if even before their stock ends, we suggest them to buy it automatically via our automated system. But it uses Angular. So the thing is, to the question from
Yeah.
Ahmed Khalid, Django is essentially a backend framework, right? Or Python or Django is a combination of backend, and then Angular or React is front end. Now, the approach that we use today, I'm not going like 5 to 10 years back, where the front end and the back end had to be coupled with views or view engine or templating. That's not the case today because we want things to be faster. We don't want to rely on the back end to serve both of the things, like the backend API and also generating views and then sending them. Server side rendering is a different concept. We are not going there, but the front end itself shouldn't have any idea of what the backend comprises of. It shouldn't care if it's Python, it is Node.js, it's Rust, as long as it's fast. So I would
Ideally
say
speaking.
exactly. So I would say that it really doesn't matter if you're using React or Angular based on Python or Django. It doesn't matter. You can use either of those. The decision to make in this situation would be, because I've been working as an engineer manager as well. I'm right now working as a software architect, overlooking a lot of products in Synchron. The decision that you have to make is based on what skills do you have right now, what kind of hiring do you want to do in the future, and also what would make sense when we get more people in or we start shuffling people around in this case, and what expertise do you want to build in the company as well. You want to go with React, that means that you would have to consider all of the things that I mentioned, like maintaining standards, making sure you have documentation, and all of the bells and whistles. So in this case, I would say either of Angular or React works really well with Django or Python or essentially any backend API because you're using REST APIs.
Right. If your front end or back end is good enough, it should work with one another.
Yep.
That's the conclusion that we.
Yep. And the demand in the US is equal for both. Maybe it has more jobs for React, but I think Angular is equivalent when it comes to like tech side of the things rather than the demand. And even Europe has the same demand for both of those.
Right. And I think even if I put a reason, my thoughts on it are, I think React, because as you already said, React has a less steeper learning curve, and more people can easily onboard on React. That's why we see more jobs on React, but Angular has its major presence.
Yeah, I think the major difference is initially TypeScript versus JavaScript. So React is JavaScript. You if you know JavaScript, if you know how for loops work, if you know about the basic concepts of JavaScript, you can really get started with it really easily. With Angular, obviously, the first change is you have to learn a bit of TypeScript, which I believe is perfectly worth it because the amount of problems that occur when we are just working with JavaScript, it's sad to be honest, and it is one of the reasons
I
why
understand.
JavaScript is, I would go as far to say, hated by a lot of people who work on different languages. For example, the people who work with Rust or C++ or Objective C or Java or name it. So I think TypeScript is one of the best things that happened with JavaScript to date. Every
Mm,
standard, every change that has come to JavaScript, TypeScript is the best thing that happened. And I
I
think
agree.
I've always hated Microsoft, especially from the days of my university where I was taught C sharp and Windows Forms. I absolutely hated Microsoft, and I've never loved Microsoft till then. But I think when we got Visual Studio Code and we got TypeScript, that is where I got a bit of softer, part of my heart kind of saying yes for Microsoft in that case. So yeah, absolutely love TypeScript.
All right. I'm the opposite actually because as an electrical engineer, I have done embedded systems in my university,
Mhm,
and in embedded systems, you mostly work with closely with the hardware.
mhm,
So I'm more inclined towards C or the low level programming languages.
mhm,
But I understand your point. What you're saying, it's a very good point.
mhm.
Um, anyway, the next my next question would be, uh, what are the life cycle of the projects developed on Angular and React? What are the differences in life cycles? Which is more, you can say, which lasts longer, or which which framework needs more updating?
So I think when it comes to updates, Angular has a really uh, defined pattern. So we expect when the update is going to come. As you already mentioned, it comes like twice a year, the major versions, and then there are minor upgrades and improvements as well.
Mm,
The switch from Angular 1 to Angular 2 or Angular JS to Angular, as now we call it, was absolutely horrifying, terrible. And that is because they had to rewrite Angular from scratch. But then it actually flew very good. And after that, there have been very less breaking changes as per se. And I think from the past 5 to 6 versions, they have been almost no breaking changes for the users or the developers. Essentially, they have only changed the internal workings of how Angular works, and they have made it backward compatible as well. So with Angular, we can expect when the release comes, and you can update it very frequent. One of the questions that I get asked from a lot of people in the community is how often we update Angular, or
mm,
when should we update an Angular version. And the answer for that is not as soon as it's out. And the reason for that is most likely your app is going to be using a third party library, and if you don't have the support for the next version, then yeah, that's going to be a problem. Sometimes the library technically supports Angular's new version, but they don't have it mentioned in the package JSON as the dependency range or the peer dependency. So it could work, but it would show you a lot of warnings. People don't like that. In other cases, I think when it comes to React, I'm not really aware of what is the life cycle of their updates, but I do know that when they provide an update, there are usually major changes. There are a lot of features as well, which is super interesting. For example, React 18 recently had a lot of cool features about server side rendering and a couple of really cool hooks that can be used both on server side and client side as well. But essentially, I think when we talk about lifecycle, I think another question would rather be which types of projects do we imagine with React versus Angular. For example, I know that when it comes to which one lasts longer, I think it's going to be more enterprise side. So Angular is the favorite when it comes to enterprise application, when it comes to
right.
long term support, and that is entirely because the teams who are building enterprises, they invest. When it comes to human resources, they invest in long term. They train people with Angular, and they want to continue going forward. They want to maintain standards. They want an opinionated way of doing things rather than everybody doing their own things, and also having a whole idea of testability when it comes to or testing essentially when it comes to building robust applications. So I think Angular is way more loved when it comes to enterprises, although it's perfectly okay, or it's actually good to also implement small applications. I think all of my passion projects that I usually build, for example, I'm working on this productivity app called Focus Doro. I built with Angular. I participated in a hackathon recently from MongoDB, and I could build a really cool app in 16 hours. And all of that was streamed live. But I could build it in 16 hours, a full stack application, which is a multiplayer game that everybody could play online, and it's real time. So people could create lobbies and compete with Angular. So I think when you know Angular, when you get to know Angular, then it really becomes easier. And when it comes to React, I think it is good for enterprise applications as well. I wouldn't say that don't go with React for enterprise applications. When
Mm,
you go with React for enterprise apps, you have to have the standards in place. You have to have a senior engineer in the team who knows or who can enforce certain rules, who can enforce architectural decisions. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of problem. I think with Angular, a lot of those architectural decisions are already taken care of by the framework itself.
Right. So I'm going off topic a little bit. Do you do gaming a little bit?
Yeah, I do. Sometimes when I just want to go away from coding for a while, or just get my mind to somewhere else, then I
Right.
usually game. I used to play Call of Duty a lot,
Right.
Warzone basically, not the new one. I hate the new one, but is right now I'm playing Apex Legends. So
Right. Right.
I try to play ranked most of the times.
Right.
But yes, I don't get a lot of chance to do that because of the amount of work I have.
All right. Basically, when I'm talking in terms, I'm a gamer also. When
Nice.
I'm talking in terms of gaming, the way you described Angular and React is, Angular is a linear, you can say a fixed story patterned game, whereas React is more like a sandbox Minecraft like thing. Would you say that is a good comparison?
Yeah, I think yeah, you could actually say that, but I think it would be also an interesting um, analogy to have, as you mentioned, with Angular you have sort of a fixed path. For example, you're playing Street Fighter, the latest one. For every hero you got a specific story going on, but then when it comes to React, then you are on an adventure because then you have side stories. You could go this way or that way, and every way you go you get some experience and then you move forward. So
Yes.
your hero per se or your player would have, I don't know which kind of experience, but it would still move forward and get to its destination. So you are going to get there, but it's not really sure that you're going to have the same experience as other players of the game.
Right. When we talk in terms of things we are interested in, things become even the things which are more technical become understandable for people who are non-technical. So that's why I decided to just put an impromptu gaming
Yes,
thing in it.
yes.
All right. Because we have about 5 to 10 minutes left. I'm just gonna ask the last question, which
Mhm.
is, what are some of the good resources that can help developers learn Angular?
Yes. So first of all, shameless plug this guy for
Right.
sure.
Of course.
This is yeah, this is unfortunately not right now available to be shipped to Pakistan. But if
Okay.
anyone has any relatives who are coming to Pakistan, then it would be wise to ask them to bring this, especially from the US, because then you also don't have to have any shipping charges to those people. Um, it's available in the Europe, so this is shipped there as well. And the PDF version is also available to be bought on Amazon. So if you're a person who reads on your mobile device or you have a tablet, then I think it would be really nice to have this the Kindle version as well. And I
Right.
think we see a lot. I think at least 50% of there could be a 2 to 1 ratio between the print version and the PDF version, because I see in my portal that there are a lot of PDF purchases. I am not really sure if all of those are from Pakistan, but I think if they are, it's a good reason uh, to have that definitely. But
Right.
yes, I would say Angular Cookbook. Then if you're starting like from zero at the moment, then it's the Angular's Tour of Heroes. If you just search Angular Tour of Heroes, you will get
Right.
the Angular's official documentation where they have you build an application with Angular. I think that's the best resource because it's very very well and thoroughly explained. If you are a mid to senior engineer with Angular, and if you want to get better, then I would suggest the Angular Cookbook. And also, if you go to ultimatecourses.com, then
Mm.
this whole platform, the Ultimate Courses, is maintained by Todd Motto, who is also a Google developers expert like me, and he's the
Mm.
person who I used to see and learn from like 6 to 7 years ago when I was nothing of a Google developers expert. But then I also became an expert, and now we both are in the same program. But I believe his courses are absolute gem. Both the Angular courses and the JavaScript courses, they are paid, of course. Then on YouTube, there is a really nice channel called Academind. So Academine, you can also look at that. There's also a really good channel called Traversy Media, so that also produces a really good content out of it. And if you want to have these channels that I'm talking about, apart from ultimate courses on YouTube, all of those are more theoretical, so they give you a really good understanding of the frameworks, how they work. If you want to look at more practical knowledge, that hey, I'm gonna see what's happening and I'm gonna code now and I'm gonna see, okay, does this work? Yes, then I'm gonna move forward and understand how this works. Then you can also look at my YouTube channel, because I usually have this same pattern, that I have hands on everything, that you sit with me, you open your laptop. I usually have the videos in form of workshops. So yes, if you're sitting with the laptop and if you're following everything that I say, in that case you will end up in the same state as I have. For example, the last video that I uploaded on my YouTube is how to make money as a JavaScript developer. And
Right.
if you follow that, then in the end you have the exact same API that I've created that you can sell and then get money from it. So yeah,
Right.
those would be the resources.
All right. So thank you very very much for your time, Essen. And this is the end of the podcast. And thank you for joining everybody to Tech Fridays. And inshallah, we'll see you next Friday. Um, and thank you very much, Mohammed Ahsan Ayaz, for your time. It's been really nice talking to you, and I personally have learned very much from our talk. And I hope the people who are watching this learned something. This will also be posted on our LinkedIn page, TransData's page. Please do visit Essence channel and look at his book, the Angular Cookbook. It's very helpful. Thank you very much, Asan. We'll see you inshallah anytime.
Awesome, sounds good. Thank you for having me, it was really good.
All right. Thank you very much.
Love this.
Allah Hafiz.